Bergson and Intensive Magnitude, Dismantling His Critique, Florian Vermeeren argues, against the majority of scholarship, that Bergson's critique of intensive magnitude in Time and Free Will is inconsistent with his later philosophy and even inconsistent with the role of a difference in degree of freedom in Time and Free Will. There are three principal errors with this interpretation which undermine Vermeeren's ability to prove the alleged inconsistency. 1. Failing to uphold the difference between concrete reality and merely derivative replacements. 2. Not appreciating the nature of continuous parts, which cannot be grasped as a totality or unit present to consciousness. And 3. Failing to grasp the significance of the generative idea in infinitesimal thought. Vermeeren's arguments nevertheless touch on the most important threads of Bergson's thought. Notably, each of these three errors indicates a central aspect of duration with which Vermeeren ultimately neglects. Namely, first, implies that duration cannot be recomposed out of the products of its analysis. 2. Implies the melting together of parts and the outstanding horizon of the future that is inherent in real duration. And 3. Implies that sympathizing directly with duration necessarily places us in contact with a generative idea. All of these three aspects are enmeshed with and imply one another, and the progress of my essay will consist in demonstrating all three. In the first section, I show how these three features of duration informed Bergson's progression from a bad to a good sense of intensity in Time and Free Will. In the second section, I go directly for Bergson's conception of duration and show how the first 2 points are in solidarity with Bergson's more mature thinking. In the final section, I will go directly for the third feature of duration and show how it formed the basis of Bergson's conception of infinitesimal thought. Moving through this progression will ultimately reveal Vermeeren's understanding of ordinal magnitude to be inadequate to grasp these three features of duration. Thus, contrary to Vermeeren's claims, ordinal magnitude, which is derivative and implies totality, cannot define intensity. I will show that Vermeeren's interpretation misses these three features of duration, and a fourth result errors: failure to see the central discovery of Time and Free Will, which indubitably displays its continuity with the later works, i.e. the two ways or tendencies of habit and intellect on the one hand, and duration and intuition on the other. The consistency of the early critique of intensity becomes clear when we consider Bergson's philosophical mission, which was to escape the effects of habit. Now, Bergson did not fully develop this critique until chapter 3 of Matter and Memory. Nevertheless, the problem still appears to have been central to Bergson's critique of intensive magnitude in Time and Free Will. Bergson argued that the reality of quality overflows the present, and that its continuity is repugnant to the constraints of representational totality. This is why he says that the dynamic way of representing things, which is required for duration, is, quote, repugnant to reflective consciousness, because the latter delights in clear-cut distinctions, which are easily expressed in words and things with well-defined outlines, like those which are perceived in space. Habit and intellect cut up the flowing continuity of concrete duration, but the results of this decomposition are derivative and are themselves unable to generate concrete continuity. Bergson's critique of intensity. Bergson saw that the theories of intensity and psychological analysis of his time were suffering from the natural tendency of the human mind to apply the habitual tools of analysis, reducing intensity to discrete units. This means that Bergson's critique of intensive magnitude is essentially a critique of quantity. He criticized, above all, psychophysics for substituting the felt intensive multiplicity with a quantity. Bergson wanted to show that speaking even metaphorically about intensity as if it was a quantity is a source of metaphysical and psychological errors. Bergson, it seems to me, had two primary goals in the critique of intensity. First, the critique of habit as responsible for the emergence of quantity, which entails a critique of the conception of being on the basis of presence. Second, the institution of a new conception of difference, namely qualitative multiplicity, which seeks the original reality prior to being divided into a difference of degree and difference of kind. Bergson achieves both of these in Time and Free Will in the Critique of Intensity, and it is on the basis of this critique that he formulated his philosophical method in Matter and Memory. In order to appreciate the Critique of Intensity, we must reintegrate these different elements. I want to start by analyzing the difference between the good and bad senses of intensity in Time and Free Will. This analysis will provide support for the first and second central claims of this essay, which are that Vermeeren neglects the difference between concrete reality and derivative replacement, and that he does not fully appreciate the nature of continuous parts. Vermeeren succumbs to these failings primarily by falling prey to the tendency of habit that Bergson is explicitly targeting in his critique of the bad senses of intensity, a tendency which, when followed through, leads to the inability to grasp continuity, which is the essence of Bergson's critique of quantity. Then I go on to examine how the good sense of intensity as a continuous multiplicity, which requires all three of the features of duration I have identified. Section 2.1. Identifying the bad senses and exploring their emergence. Bergson sought, not unlike Socrates, to lay hold of himself in the act of being ignorant. Bergson came to adopt a highly scientific and analytical mind. He was a visualizer and above all seems to have had the mind of a geometer. But he felt, especially after his encounter with the works of Herbert Spencer, that the tools of analytic thought produce a knowledge which is different in kind from the things themselves and from psychological life. The scientific mind uses general concepts which are mere translations and can only ever be approximations that never reach the things themselves. Bergson poses this question to himself, which seems to have determined all of his philosophy. What are the natural operations of the mind, and why do they fail in philosophy? Bergson answers this problem by positing two tendencies of thought. The tendency of habit ends in empty space, whereas the other, by reversing the habitual tendency, is able to follow the continuous curvature of duration as a generative idea, and ends in grasping the tension connecting the progress of becoming with the heterogeneity of qualitative multiplicity of the pure past. Real duration is strung between these two extremes, and intuition must follow the movements in both directions. But in order to do so, the mind must escape from the effects of habit, which veil from it the real continuous multiplicity, by replacing it with symbols and erasing the difference between concrete and derivative. In this way, a habitual tendency represses all awareness that reality has been substituted with signs. Habit keeps us absorbed in the signs, and Bergson calls this absorption in vital and practical action the attention to life. The result of a critique of habit is the discovery that intellect is essentially symbolic and predicative. A symbol is completely given all at once, and its totality signals to us that we can predict or foresee some future results which are of vital and practical interest to us. The sign must be given all at once if it is going to signify something. The accomplishment of significance implies that the sign has already been fully realized as adequately indicative. Not only is the sign necessarily something fully formed and fixed, it also necessarily signifies something for which we have a complete sense. Concrete duration, on the other hand, is not capable of being given as present to consciousness. It is not a symbol, representation, or totality. To sum up, into the totality of a symbol, we must deal with what has already come to be and is no longer advancing into novelty. And so, too, quantity implies there is nothing more to come. For real duration, the parts interpenetrate. One moment resumes the past and announces the future. This is what defines a continuity, that its parts are not all completely given at once or accounted for on the basis of presence. Furthermore, concrete duration involves a horizon of the future which is truly contingent and open to novelty, and therefore is not contained in the present. The critique of intensity is thus a critique of the habitual tendency of thought to reduce reality to presence to consciousness and something predictable. The good and bad senses arise in Bergson's distinction between two forms of intensity. First, intensity of a feeling, sentiment, and second, intensity of a sensation, sensation, or effort. His critique is aimed squarely at the second of these. Its failure is perhaps best experienced when Bergson summarizes the two illusions of reflective consciousness. The first consists of seeing in intensity a mathematical property of psychical states and not as a special quality, as a particular shade, nuance, of these various states. The second consists in substituting for the concrete reality or dynamic process, which consciousness perceives, the material symbol of this progress when it has already reached its end, that is to say, of the act already accomplished together with a series of antecedents. Thus we find two closely linked problems in the conception of intensity of sensation and effort, treating it as a quantity rather than continuous multiplicity of nuances of quality, and substituting for transition, passage, and progress something that is already past and no longer unfolding in duration. Intensity, conceived in terms of reflective consciousness, is wholly defined in relation to the replacement. Concrete qualitative differences, nuances, substituted by products of the retrograde movement of the intellect, which conceives of differences entirely on the basis of already accomplished their passage, and so being summed up and treated as a totality. This is evident, too, in his later 1901 synopsis of the Critique of Intensity, which I have broken into 4 parts. 1. Intensity has a good and bad sense. The bad sense is characterized by the reduction of a psychological state to the approximate magnitude of an exterior cause. This approximate magnitude is acquired by habit. Intensity is paralleled and proportional to the quantity of an external cause, either for psychophysics, a quantity of electric current, or for Spencer or James, a predicted extension of the movement that results from a muscular effort, is responsible for producing a minimal noticeable change of sensation, which is inextended. In this case, all sensations considered as a single unit, a simple quality, have the identical value of being noticeable and are measured by being more or less noticeable. The minimal noticeable change of any sensation is then considered to be the least degree of intensity. But this way of reducing sensation to a minimal noticeable difference must abandon the incommensurability of qualities which it sought to explain. There is no longer any difference between noticing blue or noticing red, any more than noticing heat or noticing muscular effort. The result is that we have dealt with feelings as if it was not something concrete, interior, qualitatively complex, and in reality, always a feeling of passage. Instead, we pretend that feeling is, in truth, merely the symbol we use to communicate it or to anticipate future actions. The good sense of intensity is a continuity of interpenetrating parts involving both differences in kind and degree. The decomposition of the parts into states is the result of analysis. They are only potentially parts. This is to say that the parts are viewed as states only by dividing it retrospectively. But in continuity of passage of an emotion, they interpenetrate. States of consciousness are mere signposts marking possible stops along the passage, treated on the basis of the completion, and decomposing what is no longer passing. But each of these signposts, in fact, marks the direction and implicitly suggests the way this path is traveled, pointing to the fact that its reality is in the movement and not the traces left behind afterwards. The degrees of tension of consciousness are degrees of difference in the continuity of qualitative multiplicity of duration. The tension of consciousness is a contraction of the past with the present, passage of the present. Tension is explained in terms of the difference between pure memory and pure perception. Thus, we find a difference in kind and a difference in degree together in an original unity of intensity discoverable in intuition. From this interpretation of Bergson's critique of the bad sense of intensity, we find that it is habit or the attention to life that substitutes the concrete with the abstract, which is the origin of quantity. This tendency hides reality behind the signs that are useful for predicting events in the world in action. Cinematographical mechanism. Bergson tells us action is the origin of measurement. Muscular effort anticipates the resistance which its force will encounter, and basic motricity implies that we measure how much force is appropriate to accomplish the intended movement in relation to an anticipated resistance. It seems to me that this account of the emergence of quantity as a function of practical action can be made intuitive by the following exercise. Press your hand very lightly against the edge of a book placed on a table. At first, the book will not even move. You must raise the amount of force until the threshold is overcome and movement begins. This degree of force will be the appropriate measure of the action. But how was it that we came to acquire a sense of this measure? It is not by an innate knowledge for dispensing exactly the amount of muscular tension, but it is acquired by observing the results of the movement and then forming a general expectation of how much change will be produced by vague degrees of force. We must form an association between the motor and sensory experiences. We anticipate a quantity of change, and however imprecise it is in fact, in principle, we assume it to be measured to an exact degree. The lived sense of extension of our motricity is something we must learn to anticipate in order to navigate the world in relation to our needs. The primary character of magnitude, extension, or measurement is linked to the usefulness of such concepts in relation to the prediction of the outcome of our actions based on our past experiences. Just looking at the book on the table is enough of a sign to tell us how much we will likely move in relation to our motricity, whereas a car, by contrast, appears to signal an altogether different degree of resistance. But any sense of magnitude here is secondary and derivative to the quality each has as a feeling of relevance to action. Thus, Bergson identifies the source of measurement in our estimation of muscular effort. The analysis of muscular effort shows that we convert the interior reality of an exterior into an exterior translation which is based entirely on the results of action. Measurement is the product of a summing up that treats reality not as a progression, but as a totality already completed. Psychophysics failed to appreciate the difference between the concrete continuity of intensity and the abstract quantity which is meant to replace it. Fechner and his followers insisted on a parallelism between the quantity of stimulation and the intensity of the feeling. Bergson, following in the French spiritualist tradition of Madame and Jules Latreille, insisted that our awareness and perception is not a passive reception of some atomic information, but rather a substitution by our activity or intentionality of sensible disturbances with the anticipated resistance. Thus, what we perceive is the anticipation of the results of our action or reaction of our body on the world around us. This data of perception, according to Latreille, to whom Bergson dedicated Time and Free Will, is twice exterior, since we first substitute the inner feeling of expending force for the movement we perceive it producing in some resistant term, and then we substitute the concrete experience of resistance with the generalization of acquired experiences which we use to predict the future. Intensive magnitude, especially as treated in psychophysics, is essentially the same as the attempt to create time out of instances, movement out of immobile stops, or a curve out of tangents. A sensible minimum is extracted and then made identical to all other sensations by reducing it to a minimal sensible difference. On the basis of the derivative quantity, the psychophysicist throws out the felt difference of qualitative multiplicity. We feel temperatures differently. The quality of cold in the fall breeze is not an arithmetical difference from the bitter cold of winter. The minimal sensible difference, which is meant to define the sensation of both fluctuations, is treated as identical. But in fact, they are qualitatively distinct, and each has a value which is directly reflective of our vital needs. The fall breeze can feel rather nice at the end of a hot summer, but exposure in the bitter cold of winter has an absolute value in relation to our survival. The intensity of pure sensations would be the raw feeling, so to speak, of our body in motion. One can focus all attention on feeling contracting the tension of duration into the present becoming and coinciding with a flux of differentials, which would be matter itself. But if this flux of differentials is going to be a sensible intuition in which we feel its qualitative multiplicity, memory will need to hold it all together by continuous threads. Each moment of experience, quote, extends over a certain depth of duration, and memory condenses in each an enormous multitude of vibrations which appear to us all at once, although they are successive. We never experience these theoretical, instantaneous sensations as isolated or separate. When we are out in the cold and trying to coincide with the instantaneous value of the quality of cold, instinct will kick in and demand we protect ourselves. The cold becomes a sign. It is as if a flash of lightning illuminates a landscape at night. End quote. The pure perception arises in an instant and illuminates the needs of our body. The infinite multiplicity of nuances of feeling are reduced to a single value in relation to our possible action, which is to say, the sensation becomes a sign. The problem with intensive magnitude is thus that it assumes the instantaneous apprehension of a magnitude fully given to consciousness. These bits and pieces of experience are no more than artificially chopped up and isolated moments of a continuous experience in which each moment has some relevance to our life. We will never succeed in reconstructing reality from the parts artificially divided. In order to avoid this task of reintegrating the derivative quantities, Bergson attempted to place us back into the continuous progress of intensity, which is in no way an instantaneous, but is marked by a gradual evolution in which moments interpenetrate. Section 2.2. The proper sense of intensity in time and free will. We have just seen that Bergson rejected the interpretation of intensity which attempts to translate it into magnitude, and he furthermore showed that magnitude emerges from action and is the product of an acquisition, such as observing the movements resulting from the exercise of force, by means of which we try to predict the effects of a future event. This is what Bergson calls the intensity of a simple state. Bergson's critique of intensive magnitude in time and free will is not an outright rejection of intensity as a philosophical or psychological reality. Bergson is clear that intensity of feeling, sentiment, is progressive change of quality wherein the parts interpenetrate. He wanted to develop a paradigmatic example of dynamic sense of intensity of feeling of a complex state, and perhaps did this most strikingly in relation to Spencer's account of gracefulness from his essays, which I will examine now in order to help illustrate the feeling of intensity as a qualitative multiplicity. Spencer explained grace in terms of an effort that implies the calculation of magnitudes of intensity. Grace is then nothing but an economy of force, i.e., a perfectly calculated expenditure of force, so that force is dispensed with the greatest ease. In fact, this way of conceiving grace is to treat it externally and mechanically. For Bergson, the feeling of grace involves an interior attitude guiding the movement. We sympathize with the intentionality of the movement and thereby feel the importance of our own inner duration, striving, and intentionality. Grace is almost a pure form of the good sense of intensity, a pure aesthetic sentiment. And perhaps it's the most beautiful expression. Bergson describes grace as an intentional directing of an interior effort which guides movements by a sort of dance. This dance must flow continuously, and so be free from jerks and interruptions. Each of its changes flows into the next and, quote, announces those which are to follow. Thus, grace is described in terms very close to concrete duration, since it implies the interpenetration of its moments. If curves are more gracious than broken lines, the reason is that while a curved line changes its direction at every moment, every new direction is indicated in the preceding one. This connection to curves is very important, considering Bergson's later emphasis on calculus and the integral of unity of duration. What is at issue here is the interior intentionality guiding mobility, what Bergson would later call a generative idea, which produces the variations of movement but unites them in a persistent aim. When we feel something to be graceful, we do not merely represent something external. Rather, we sympathize with the power and ease achieved by presiding over actions, of being able to conduct actions with precision. But this is only the first step, and Bergson indicates a deeper stage of this development. Quote, "The truth is that in anything that we call very graceful, we observe ourselves able to unravel, besides the levity which is a sign of mobility, some suggestion of a possible movement towards ourselves, of a virtual and even nascent sympathy. This is to say that the feeling of grace stirs in us a sense of our own freedom. This means that sentiments are self-sufficient, having an inner source of their development and intensification. The feeling of grace is a growing intensity or qualitative progress, but we interpret it as a change of magnitude because we like simple thoughts and because our language is ill-suited to render the subtleties of psychological analysis." End quote. The growing intensity is real in the qualitative progress. When we look back on what came before, we can consider those prior states as elements which were combined in order to produce the later results. We thus tend to cut up the continuity and ignore the proper indivisibility, i.e., the indivisibility of a continuous creative or generative progress. With these descriptions of sentiment, Bergson shows intensity, first, implies that duration cannot be composed out of the products of analysis, and second, implies the melting together of the parts and the outstanding horizon of the future that is inherent in real continuity, and three, implies a need to return to concrete reality. Intensity in its proper sense is fundamentally musical. And just as music is primarily suggestive as opposed to expressive, so too metaphysics must evoke a feeling of the absolute. In Time and Free Will, Bergson opposed music to mathematics as concrete qualitative multiplicity of listening, attending to the sounds as a melody, is opposed to the mere notation written on a piece of paper. Music unfolds in time, and thus always something incomplete, always something playing out and transitioning. Concrete duration is a feeling of intensity like, quote, "the indivisible and indestructible continuity of the melody, where the past enters into the present, which remains undivided and even indivisible in spite of what is added at every instant, or rather, thanks to what is added." While a piece of music seems to be a totality, since it is already written and has a start and end, nevertheless, the reality of music is the concrete events of its sounding and resonating in time. Thus, music is really the epitome of concrete duration. Section 3. From differences of degree to degrees of difference. Real continuity. We just saw how Bergson separated out a good from a bad sense of intensity. The good sense of intensity involves concrete continuity, wherein the moments are not able to be dealt with in isolation, since their very existence is a temporalizing and interpenetrating. This is the essential point of view of Bergson. All real, that is, concrete multiplicity, must be conceived as degrees of difference. Space, conceived as relations of container and contained, is pure exteriority and is merely abstract. In fact, this is the way that a difference of degree at first appears, as an infinitely divisible homogeneous container. Quote, "We call that which contains the other the greater quantity." End quote. In this section, I will further explicate the role of the good sense of intensity in Bergson's treatment of quality, quantity, and his new conception of degree of difference. According to Vermeuren's interpretation, Bergson constructed a dualism between quality and quantity, in which qualities are essentially differences in kind. Each quality is an utterly unique form, and on the other hand, quantity is essentially a difference of degree as a homogeneous container, space. I will show that we would not get Bergson's proper form of difference by merely combining these two, since this conception of quality and quantity relies on each being static, each being a totality. It is not a matter of synthesizing concepts or collapsing a dualism, but of uncovering the relationship of concrete and derivative and returning to the absolute reality of lived duration. When Bergson set up a dualism between quality and quantity in time and free will, it was not a conception of qualities as static totalities, as in the first and fourth chapters of Matter and Memory, but rather quality as the passage of intensity characterized by continuous multiplicity. Bergson writes that it is by grace of the quality of quantity that we find the idea of quantity without quality. Quantity exists in and is extracted from the continuous qualitative multiplicity of lived duration. Bergsonian intensity is not, as in Kant's example in the Anticipations of Perception, analogous to a coin, which he called a continuous quantity, and given in its totality and presentational immediacy. So this is the first problem with expressing intensity as magnitude. Continuous multiplicity cannot be summed up because its reality is a passage. The repugnance to expression, which is characteristic of continuous multiplicity, is the reason Bergson's degree of difference cannot be reduced to ordinality. Vermeuren is correct to say that the degrees of contraction of memory, for example, in the third chapter of Matter and Memory, strike the reader as very similar to intensive magnitudes. But it is incorrect to assume that a degree of contraction of memory can be conceived as a totality, as given all at once, as a discrete unit capable of being compared to others merely in terms of before and after. While one ordinal magnitude is indeed not contained in another, there is nevertheless always a unit which itself must be given in full and must be indivisible. The indivisible unity of duration is not a quantity, and the whole duration as indivisible is not capable of being present to consciousness in an instant. The indivisibility of duration is not a unit given as a totality, but rather the indivisibility of the continual passage, quote, thanks to which it is added. Listening to a musical performance is always incomplete, always being prolonged, and is continuously unfolding so long as we are still listening to it. The song cannot be grasped by a single presentation to consciousness, but unrolls in the thickness of a duration that is still in the making. The indivisible unity of continuity is therefore not a quantity, nor its multiplicity a mere ordinality. Paul-Antoine Miquel argues against the objections like Vermeuren's, which assert that Bergson was wrong to deny the ordinal magnitude as appropriate to expressing duration. He does this by showing that for Bergson, the relation of before and after, an old present and the present now passing, is not a mere a priori comparison reducible to an asymmetrical relation, but is rather a lived feeling, the relevance of which is immanent to the content, and therefore the act of comparison itself is an irreversible transformation of the force and relevance of the relata. With a mere ordinal relation, we lose the real continuity by which one moment interpenetrates others, and through which an infinity of qualitative variations is united by a common direction and progression. To put it bluntly, the significance of the seventh note in a melody is not merely its asymmetrical relation of the following in order, but involves a complex qualitative nuance that must be felt in the progression of its development. The fact that degree of difference is not simply ordinality or succession is clear in Bergson's conception of degrees of consciousness. Bergson famously explains the degrees of difference of consciousness, which are, properly speaking, degrees of memory, by the image of a cone. Each section of the cone represents a degree of contraction. Why use a cone to represent this rather than, say, a spring or an elastic span, as he does elsewhere? I think there are perhaps two reasons. One is conceptual, the other almost autobiographical or historical. The second reason, which goes beyond the purview of this essay, the cone of memory, is in fact the reversal of a cone which Bergson used to explain the relation of unity and multiplicity in Plotinus. The first reason, the one we will investigate here, is that each contraction of the cone is still intimately connected to the whole shape. The cone is one continuous shape, which unites a mathematical point and an indefinitely increasing circle. As Bergson says in an introduction to metaphysics, neither the point nor the circle nor the juxtaposition of the two on a plane will give me the slightest idea of a cone. It is the same for the multiplicity and unity of psychological life. End quote. Now, while it is not clear that this is exactly the same cone as the one in Chapter 3 of Matter and Memory, it nevertheless seems to have this important similarity. It expresses the continuity of an infinite degree of contraction, such that each is a contraction of the whole. That is to say, each part contains the whole in its own degree of contraction. Thus, each degree is not merely juxtaposed with an infinite variety of others, but rather they all interpenetrate and contain each other. This whole is both simple and yet involves an infinity of differences. The degrees are not merely larger and smaller, but are parts of a continuity uniting two different things, i.e., a point and a circle. These two, considered on their own, are seemingly incompatible, since a point has no breadth at all. It is in fact unextended, and a circle is, of course, a line. No intellectual recomposition is able to explain the continuity found immediately in the entire cone, and there is no need to artificially recompose it that way, since the whole cone gives us them concretely. One cannot expect to go from the point back to the base, since the point has no breadth, it cannot grow. But we can easily see how from the base, we only have to make the sides converge into the point. Likewise, we cannot hope to see how we can make experience out of a single indivisible intensive magnitude. We must not start with the point, which is only the limit of the continuous whole, but rather we must start with the whole and see how it continuously unites these two opposite views, these antagonistic concepts of point and base. Now we need only to make the point represent the continuous becoming of the present, passing present, and the base represent the pure past, as Bergson did in the third chapter of Matter and Memory, and we can come to appreciate the way real continuity exceeds presence to consciousness. What is most crucial here is the fact that no two degrees of quantitatively different, nor are they merely ordinal, which would make the base of the cone further in the past and make the middle closer to the present. This interpretation is certainly excluded by Bergson. Rather, each expresses a plane of consistency, a referential totality in which many memories relate to each other by means of some consistency of relevance, which they all have in relation to some form of action or a persona. There is a degree of contraction of one's past that gathers together the persona directing their life as a musician, everything related to their musical persona, education, practice, listening. All of this will be relevant to their consciousness when they gather themselves in this degree of contraction. When a skilled musician goes to play, if they put themselves into it fully, doing so will involve more and more past experiences. This will be a contraction of the whole past in which everything that is relevant to being a musician is gathered, fanning out into irrelevance. Center stage is a whole system of signs, habitual actions, and the emotions and attitudes which predominate in this persona. If we take two very different degrees of contraction, say the one's musical persona, and on the one hand nearer to the base, and on the other hand their memories related to something very trivial, like the faint memory of some annoying jingle heard in a commercial. contractions of habit near the point. What we see is that one degree can easily integrate a vast multitude of memories, and the other hardly scratches the surface of one's deeper self. Thus, when we repeat the jingle mindlessly, the self is involved in only a small degree, while the skilled musician throws almost their whole being into the performance. The key point is that these two degrees of tension have altogether different significance in life. They are heterogeneous in the strongest sense of the word. Beyond the alternatives of difference of degree and difference of kind, we have a third option, degrees of difference. But it is not possible for degrees of difference to be represented, symbolized, made into concepts. The only unit of degrees of difference is the contraction of the whole at varying degrees of concentration, each of which involves the whole. This conception of degrees of difference is clearly expressed in the concrete continuity of the integral past and the passage of sensation. Intensity, therefore, refers to the growing complexity of feeling as it integrates new, irreversible transformations of relevance, contracting more and more details. To summarize, we have just seen that the whole, which is needed to characterize real continuity, is conceived as a degree of difference, and each degree is a heterogeneous contraction and is incapable of being represented in a totality or in terms of presence to consciousness. Furthermore, there is no way for habit or intellect to grasp this excess beyond presence. Furthermore, the whole of duration extends beyond the totality of presence to consciousness and is therein repugnant to being translated into quantity. By examining the good and bad senses of intensity, we have found Bergson's own sense of intensity, and the degrees of contraction of consciousness are neither inconsistent nor based on a naive understanding of ordinal magnitude. Section 4. The role of the generative idea in infinitesimal thought. Bergson's conception of metaphysics has as its primary concern the task of thinking concrete duration without representing it by static concepts, symbols, quantities, or other artificial means. Metaphysics must place us back into the reality of change, motion, and time. In an introduction to metaphysics, Bergson declared that metaphysics must operate what he called qualitative integrations. And in Matter and Memory, he says that, quote, the final effort of philosophical research is a true work of integration. Metaphysics, end quote. Metaphysics must make use of infinitesimal thought, and this, as is the case in its mathematical role, involves the summing up of an infinite number of infinitely small parts. Duration is, for Bergson, just such an integral unity, and what he calls a continuous and qualitative multiplicity. As in Bergson's famous example of a feeling which traverses a color spectrum, duration is a continuous variation of qualities in which moments interpenetrate, and each summarizes those that came before and announces those to come. Duration must be conceived as the unity of an unlimited diversity, which is implied in qualitative multiplicity. Bergson extends this sense of integration to movements generally and insists that we must appeal to the interiority of motion and inner organization and intention, or else motion will be composed artificially, as with Zeno's paradoxes, out of immobility. Bergson's adoption of infinitesimal thought is entirely concrete. It seeks the integration of qualitative multiplicity in real duration. Bergson sought to give infinitesimal thought the greatest distinction among the human faculties and to make integration the very generative principle of reality itself. Vermeeren seems to miss the key distinction between absolute and relative in Bergsonism when he says, quote, Bergson thus relativizes mathematics' capacity to grasp mobility, end quote. Bergson, in fact, pushes the work of integration to its absolute. Absolute for Bergson is complete, and the complete concrete reality of a multiplicity is an integral in the realist sense. Vermeeren mistakes the representation for the real movements. Quote, in differential calculus, at least in the dynamic conception of Leibniz and Newton, quantities are understood as variations, end quote. Here again we find the same attempt to erase the difference between concrete reality and the mere derivative. This is made clear in the way Newton defined the flexion. The curve is not composed of tangents. The tangent is not a straight line, and the tangent is a straight line and is different in kind from a curve, just as a stop is different from movement. Bergson, in fact, distinguished between two conceptions of the infinitely small, saying, quote, "If we compare the two notions of the infinitely small thus obtained, the one that I will call, by exaggerating things, sterile, and the other I will call then fertile, here is what we find. In the first case, the infinitely small is treated as a simple artifice of calculation, as I said earlier, and in the second case, it is treated as reality." End quote. Every part of a curve in its entirety, integralité, is a curvature, produced by a generative idea guiding the gracious movement of its continuous bending. To view it as a tangent is merely derivative. The infinitely small need not be conceived only as a derivative. It can also be a positive reality which engenders magnitude and quantity. But in that case, we do not have imitations, approximations, but simply a theoretical notion of the smallest conceivable change, smallest conceivable transition. We do not have points or instances, but infinitely small movements and durations. Bergson goes into depth on this in the lectures from the Collège de France, titled History of the Idea of Time. Quote, in duration are infinitely small parts. There are even only infinitely small magnitudes, as quantity, but infinitely small as intention, as intensity, because that is duration. It is mobile intention, and intention is intuition. It is something that always implies, from the point of view of analysis, a duality. Two mathematical points, although in itself it is always a unity. In other words, the infinitely small is a negative notion as long as one claims to reach it by division, the decomposition of which is, but it becomes a positive notion and a reality when we no longer tend to only a part of it. We will never arrive at the infinitely small by division, but we can leave it, and if we leave it, it is because we place ourselves in duration, properly speaking. We arrive at a reality, at something positive. End quote. The derivative concept is not the thing itself, but is instead infertile. Derivatives do not engender the integral unity as infinite parts which are juxtaposed like atoms. This kind of composition is artificial, external, and relative. Rather than a dynamic fluxion that is a real movement, we merely measure the average of a minimal interval of the change and then treat the interval as if it was the reality. It is merely an approximation, the continuity of which is due only to the mind and not to the real things. But there is a concrete sense in which the infinitely small parts are real and fertile, i.e. in the qualitative multiplicity. This is simply the distinction between relative and absolute, imperfect and perfect. The relative is always a decomposition of elements and relies on the artificial reintroduction of continuity by interior duration. Intensity must only be treated as an interior reality. As soon as we conceive the infinitely small parts as tangents, we translate the curve into terms that are external and relative. The infinity of figures can be used to square the circle, approaching it by a passage to the limit, an infinity of approximations which converge on real curvature of a circle. In this case, the jump between infinity of approximations and the integral unity of graceful curving movement, drawing the circle by a simple intention. Concrete duration implies a generative idea, an interior feeling of the graceful movement of fluxuous lines, a continuous thread of memory. This idea is not a representation or a concept present to consciousness, but more akin to creative emotion in Bergson's later works. Quantity always decomposes the continuity into a discrete multiplicity, and habit erases the difference. Vermeeren misinterprets Bergson's sense of qualitative multiplicity because he does not uphold the difference between concrete and derivative of the infinitely small. This failure is manifest in the treatment of irreversibility of time. Vermeeren writes that, quote, "The directionality of time in thermodynamical theory is the result of adopting a different concept of quantity or magnitude, namely intensive magnitude, and not of an abolishment of magnitude or quantities. On the contrary, the directionality of time is due to concrete duration and the difference in kind between past and passing. The suggestion that irreversibility results from a concept is exactly what such an approach to Bergson fails to grasp. A concept is always an imitation and approximation and is sterile rather than generative. Irreversibility, in the psychological sense as élan vital and in the deeper metaphysical sense of intuition and creative emotions, implies the creativity of time which continuously transforms and evolves the relations of events it compares, and is not a mere a priori form of asymmetrical comparison. Conclusion. It seems to me that Bergson's methodology has little to do with synthesizing the concepts of difference of degree and kind, or provisionally setting up a dualism in order to collapse it into a monism. His whole philosophical method seems rather to be summed up in the English introduction to matter and memory, i.e., a critique of the faculties in terms of their practical, vital exercise. Bergson, in fact, assumes the dualism between two ways as two tendencies. He then uses it as a methodological clue to investigate the problems of psychology and metaphysics. This is what is referred to as the problem of substitution and is consistent not only with his later works, but in fact a continuation of French spiritualism. Bergson never resolved this duality into a monism. The intuition of concrete duration or of the élan vital must remain different in kind from habit, intellect, science, in its remotest aspirations, universal mathematics, and the spirit of systems. Furthermore, the past remains irreducible to the passing of the present, which is the fundamental tension of duration as such. Therefore, there is no monism between concrete reality and derivative symbolic replacement. They are two irreducible directions. The critique of intensive magnitude should thus be understood in relation to the problem of replacement substitution. The critique is consistent with both later Bergsonism and Bergson's own testimony on intensity conceived dynamically as continuous multiplicity. Intensity is therefore a central concept of Bergsonism, so long as we do not conceive of it as a quantity, succession, or ordinality. It can only be treated if we place ourselves in real